Mark Pellegrino, I want to start with just asking how much of that Yaron Brook versus Vaush debate did you end up watching? I have to say, after you tweeted about it, I made it all the way through, and I'm kind of mortified. Not great.
I think I made it all the way through to before the closing comments. So if you saw anything extraordinary there, do let me know.
I will let you know. I mean, the sort of rise of these Twitch age kind of political commentators has been pretty striking to me. I mean, they're popping up in a lot of places, conventions, political circles that I've never seen them in before, particularly like in the libertarian space. How long have you been following the work of Vaush, sort of this libertarian, self-ascribed libertarian socialist streamer? It's been pretty relevant for a long time.
Yeah, well, I didn't really know about him until Yaron's encounter with him. So like you, he was a stranger to me. And it is disturbing to hear that he's in the libertarian movement and legitimately considered to be in the libertarian movement.
Yeah. Do you follow this stuff much, Robby?
No, I've just become aware of who this person is. I am aware that they were at a libertarian event over the weekend that I think you were at. You know, I work for Reason Magazine, an organization that carefully kind of monitors and pays attention to who is and is not in the libertarian movement. It's obviously an amorphous category. In some sense, we want to draw very broad, a big tent, right? Because we want to say there are more libertarians in order to make the movement look like it's growing. But the political environment over the last a few years, you know, it's presented challenges, I think, because we're in such a tribal duopoly, such a red versus blue, that for alternative ways of thinking that are freeing from those cages of tribal identification, it's harder to break through with them.
Yeah, and Mark, I think that's kind of one of the reasons that personalities like that have sort of risen as a real interest, particularly amongst younger people, for people who are perceived to not be batting for any of the establishment teams. Like that was kind of always the appeal of certain libertarians. But then you sort of even have like sort of outside actors who push the Libertarian Party to be better. I think of Objectivist as being kind of one of those people. You're pretty exasperated with sort of the libertarian status quo, right?
Oh, totally. Well, that's why I co-founded another party called the American Capitalist Party, because I see the intellectuals in the libertarian movement embracing anarchy, which I think is the antithesis of capitalism and free markets. I don't think you can have real liberty with anarchy. It's just the other side of the status coin. And I think this is the case when you decouple liberty from reason, and when you make a claim that there can be such a thing as politics without ethics.
Well, this is probably a good moment to just pause real quick and say hello to everybody watching or listening. This is Right Now on Rightly. I'm your host, Stephen Kent. I am being joined today by Robby Soave. He's the senior editor of Reason Magazine and author of the brand new book, Tech Panic: Why We Shouldn't Fear Facebook or the Future. And you've seen his magnificent symmetrical mug on shows like Supernatural, Lost, Dexter, and the new Showtime series American Rust. Mark Pellegrino, actor and co-founder, as he mentioned, of the American Capitalist Party, is here on the show with us today. Mark, I was watching an interview of yours from like 5 years ago on the Rubin Report, and you were giving sort of this top-line answer to what objectivism is, sort of explaining the Ayn Randian philosophy of doing what is good for oneself as sort of rational and inherently in your best self-interest, and something that is actually virtuous. And it was really remarkable because the conversation was in 2016, so pre-pandemic, before what I view as one of the biggest dress rehearsals for your ideology and worldview possible. So I wanted to ask you, in the past year, watching COVID-19 play out, what have you sort of learned as a self-described objectivist, or sort of had confirmed about the way that you view the world?
Well, I'm a little disturbed at how quickly people fell into the statist regimen, and how quickly they wanted to drag everybody into this regimen as if it was good, and that made me see how people are prepared to violate supposedly inviolable rights, provided the common good is at stake. and how deeply saturated that notion is in our culture is a little bit disturbing. But what was also good was to see the counter movement out there, to see on how many different levels the sense of life of America is still alive. It's just confused. And so we had the spectacle of people really fighting for something good, like liberty, but going into Walmarts and starting fights with people because they wouldn't wear their masks. So they're confused, but their spirit is in the right place. So, yeah, disheartening to see so many picking up the status mantle, but heartening to see that the sense of life in America is still there. It's still alive and beating. It's just on life support.
You know, I think of objectivism as one of its kind of most important tenets or easiest thing to explain to someone who maybe doesn't know what it is that it's all about your right, the importance of, and your right to pursue your self-interest, to put your values and your desires first. You have that right. Every person has that right. You don't have to put other people's needs ahead of your own. If you care, you can prioritize other people's needs if you care about that, but it's up to you. And the pandemic obviously was a challenge to that, because now you have all of these authorities in our society saying, no, that's wrong. You have to put the needs of everyone else ahead of yourself. And if you're doing that, that will cause you to support all these kinds of mitigation efforts. But then, you know, Mark, as we're seeing, the people then who get to make those decisions for, well, what is in everybody's best interest, they so often, and this is what I think is good for promoting objectivism, they show that they cannot be trusted to decide what that is on behalf of other people.
Yeah, that's true. The unfortunate part about statism, one of the many unfortunate parts about statism, is how it robs you of your individual moral agency. So people come to expect that somebody should tell them what to do, and that your health, your well-being is somebody else's responsibility, not your own. And objectivism, I think, provides the philosophical framework and the ethical framework for people to justify this idea that your life is your own and moral agency is good and self-responsibility is good.
Can you talk a little bit more about where that philosophy comes from and sort of unpack the Ayn Randian version of the good and responsibility for others? I understand the story of Atlas Shrugged to be really hostile to a couple of different things, including one, the idea that the problem necessarily of your neighbor is therefore yours, and also that being indecisive is in and of itself something that is also undesirable. Could you unpack it a little bit for us?
Yeah, what Rand was doing was painting archetypes. She wasn't painting the world as it is, but as it ought to be in her mind. We live in a mixed world where there's a lot of philosophical confusion, and so there's going to be quite a bit of indecisiveness as people are either imbued with radical skepticism or whatever ideology happens to be dominant. That kind of epistemological confusion is going to be more rampant than Rand would give it credit for.
I keep coming back in my mind to the question of masks. And if you were going to kind of have a conversation focused on doing a thing that is supposedly good for yourself while also doing a thing that is supposedly good for others, it all comes back to masking. I can't think of a more picturesque example for the entire debate around whether objectivism makes any sense or not than this concept, because there's this sort of mythology around masking that it is a thing that is done necessarily to protect you, but then we also get this sort of mixed message from health officials, and it's changing every day, that it's really more about a group behavior. Like masking only works if everybody in an entire setting is wearing a mask, but if everybody is wearing a mask in one room and not you, you are no more protected if you were otherwise.
But I think the most infuriating part of it is that you can't, we're developing mask policy at the level of, okay, everyone has to do this or no one can do this, right? Democratic places under Democratic control want to require mask mandates in all sorts of settings, including schools, despite very little risk of COVID to young people. And then some Republican officials want to say, no, we're going to prohibit even private, entities, that private businesses or places where whoever owns this space should have the control over what the rules for it are. We're going to tell them what to do. So it's like on either side, it's not what a libertarian or I don't think what an objectivist would want the situation to be, right, Mark?
Correct. Yeah, we're caught between two tribes who are just warring with each other over which collective they're protecting. For the left, it's the everybody in the world, and for the right, it's their particular tribe and their notion of liberty. It's pretty ugly.
How would someone of your viewpoint offer an alternative, though, for how you would approach perhaps like just this situation, right, with mask policy and how we should approach vaccinations? Because we've already reached this point where we've got not a critical mass of people who are vaccinated, but enough to sort of reach that threshold of we're moving towards herd immunity, we're going to get past this thing, and yet we've not moved past mandatory masking policies state to state. How would an
or in the District of Columbia here?
Yeah, I mean, like, how would an objectivist actually handle this and govern? Maybe governing's against the idea, but that's the world we live in, right?
Well, I think it's a personal sovereignty issue and a property rights issue. Everybody has to make these decisions with respect to their own context. If you own a business and you consider it more safe for people who are entering your business to wear a mask, then that should be your right, given that you own the property. And as a sovereign individual, you have your own separate context. It's very different from everybody else's, and you have the right to decide based on that context whether getting the vaccination is appropriate for you or not. I think one of the main, misapprehensions about individualism and selfishness is that it creates this atomization of human beings. But the simple fact of the matter is every person is connected to lots of other people. Lots of other people I value lots of other people, and I work towards enriching those people's lives. I'm not just alone in this. And that counts as my own individual values, right? And that counts as working for my own individual values. So selfishness is a lot wider a concept than I think the enemies of selfishness want to make it out to be.
When you talk about the selfishness part of this, is the idea that like Ayn Rand and people like yourself believe that all people will inevitably do the thing that is right for them. Like it talks about sort of that idea in like life or death terms, and that people who don't subscribe to the selfishness is good idea are lying basically about their own motives, and that people say they do things for others, but in reality, we all naturally do the thing that is good for us.
No, I don't think that's true. I don't think we naturally do the thing that's good for us. I think only by thinking it out and reasoning our context out do we do the right things for us. So, I don't think she would ever say that we inherently do that or that all actions are selfish. There are actions that are probably not selfish. Even if you could pretend to say, the jihadist is really doing it for the 72 virgins that he wants in the afterlife. He's still acting against his life. He's still, in fact, in concrete reality, acting against his life. And his ideal is not based in reality, so it's a selfless act.
And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about how the importance of selfishness to objectivism. I think that word trips people up. You can still. It might be the case that
the word selfishness.
It might be the case that making other people happy gives me so much value and joy. So you do things for others. You treat other people well and fairly, and you even attend to other people's needs, but you do that because that has value to you, and so that's the kind of selfishness we're talking about. That's perfectly compatible with an objectivist framework. Do I have that right, Mark?
I think that's true, but also the idea that you deserve to be the beneficiary of your work, of everything you value and work towards. You deserve that. Okay, so I don't know what you would call that, if that's sort of a political spin on what selfishness is, but it's just simply you deserve to get what you've earned.
Yeah, I mean, and kind of going back just like to the masking element and what you just laid out there, Robby, is when I was at the airport this weekend, coming back and forth between Nashville, in the airport terminal, there are signs up everywhere, just, laminated and put up on walls willy-nilly, saying that you have to mask in the terminal. And everyone's sitting there masking, and basically they buy snacks so that they can find a reason to pull their mask down and get any excuse. Because when you're eating and drinking, COVID's not a thing. You walk through the terminal and everybody on each side of the restaurants are not masking, and they're all completely safe, but we all in the terminal have to wear them for some reason. And when I got seated, I pulled my mask down and I put it underneath my chin. No food, no drink, because I wanted to breathe clearly. And the woman next to me, it took about 20 minutes for her to say anything. She leaned over and she asked me if I could put my mask on. And I was very happy to do that. And I said to her, and my answer was, I'm happy to do that for you. I'm happy to do that for you, but I will not do it for these signs on the wall put up by a faceless, nameless person for reasons that they don't understand, that they're just doing.
I can't do it anymore. In the line at the grab and go places in DC, like Chop Salad or whatever, where there are people unmasked eating, because you have to be unmasked when you're eating, but while you're in the line to get the food. And again, this isn't the company. If the private company making that decision, I'm fine with. This is the city. This is the status dictating the totally irrational policy. Gyms in DC asked the government, said, we would like to require vaccination of our customers. We don't want to require masks, but your policy says we have to require masks. So could we do a substitution? That would make perfectly logical sense. We'd rather have people vaccinated than in masks. The masks you have to do forever. It's a stopgap. We want people vaccinated. The government said, no, you cannot do that. No, it's totally irrational, and we shouldn't be governed by it. That's my view.
Amen.
Yeah, Mark, I came across this article a while back in Business Insider, and it was titled, and about the pandemic, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged has been completely unraveled by the pandemic. And the reason cited is because of supply chain breaks, so the system of sort of the economy breaking down based on people's needs and health, and then also the question of masking. I just want to put it before you, like, what's your rebuttal to that? Because I do see challenges to the ideology in the past year that we've experienced, but not a dismantling of the ethic. If anything, I sort of see exactly the opposite with the way that people have sort of fallen into line, goot-stepping over policies that they don't understand, and virtue signaling rather than doing things that are actually rooted in being good for your neighbor.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the breaks in the supply chain were entirely the fault of the government. I think the private sector could have met any needs that we had, but they were prevented from doing so by a hysterical, power-lusting group of people in Washington and in the state governments. To me, that proves Atlas Shrugged's point more than anything, because it's the statists who are ruining the world, and it's the private entrepreneurs who decide to go on strike because they can't take being exploited anymore.
Yeah,
I've never heard any real. I've never heard any real refutations of objectivism. I've heard some fake ones, but no real ones. If you know of any, let me.
It's Mark. You're in the entertainment industry, and I feel like people in the entertainment industry have been some of the. They're not following the rules that everyone else has to live under. I'm thinking of the Met Gala, the Emmys this year. You have a lot of fancy, well-dressed, unmasked people, which I totally support them being able to do that. But then the workers all behind them are masked because they have to still be following, and it's part of this whole in the pandemic. We have to the working people have to follow the rules the government made for them, but the wealthy and the influential and the well-connected and the famous do not, which is unfair.
I agree with you. If it's any consolation, working on a set is strictly regimented, and they have COVID monitors on the set that make sure you're wearing your mask at all times. And even when you have to take your mask down to take a drink, you're instructed to go to a drink station several feet away from any other masked actor who's already been vaccinated, of course. And this is with the whole crew and cast of a show being vaccinated. So yeah, on the social side, they're certainly showing their elitism. But when it comes to work, everybody's sort of following the same rules.
Yeah. Well, I got to admit, even when we have any conversation that is in any way related to COVID-19 and the pandemic, I get incredibly nervous because this show is put out on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and all that stuff. And any discussion about this is basically going through a very subjective and willy-nilly moderation system where it is never clear to me on any given day exactly what the rules are besides the whims of an individual moderator. These conversations just make me nervous. I don't want the show to ever, get a red flag or anything on it. And so I want to ask you, Mark, about the entire question of kind of free speech and the way that corporations, particularly social media companies, are playing in the realm of controlling the flow of information and discussion. Are you concerned about the free speech environment being driven forward by the Facebooks, YouTubes, Twitters of the world?
No.
Why?
No, provided they don't embed themselves in government. I mean, the fact that people who work for these tech firms become a part of the administration, and to the degree that these companies start synchronizing their ideas with the political administration, that's scary. But just because they're a big platform, they allow us to say and do what we want, pretty much, that edits its content based on their ideology. That doesn't disturb me in the least, because I trust the market to produce some alternative to them. And they started to with what you might call Parler. It was sort of shut down and then restarted again, right? Do you guys know anything about what happened with Parler?
Yeah, it's back up. I actually got verified on Parler before anywhere else, but I've said a couple of times in this show, like I couldn't stand the climate in that app because the sort of total lack of moderation made the space entirely dedicated to vitriolic politics and nothing else. And like, who wants to be in a space like that? It was just unpleasant all the time.
But Mark, as an objectivist, you have to, as I do, kind of recoil in horror at some of these congressional hearings where, people like Dorsey and Zuckerberg, who, we might criticize some of the things they do and say, and certainly the overlap with government policy. But in those hearings, they're often being berated by senators who have no idea what they're talking about. And I find myself, only a casual consumer of Rand, thinking maybe they should go on intellectual strike, right? They should shut down or kick the senators off the platforms at least to teach them all a lesson.
Oh, kick them off, and at the very minimum, make a speech in front of these jerk-offs. Let them know who's boss, and that as a constituent, the people interviewing them or abrading them, as you say, are actually their servants and should stop. And if they want to make these hearings about really gathering information and figuring out what this platform is about, make it about that. I don't know if these guys have the cashews to stand up and do that kind of thing. Draw the lines in the sand. But the power is really with them if they can do it.
You mentioned something about kind of like not being concerned about what social media companies do in the space of speech and, kind of governing the discussions that we can and cannot have on this show about the pandemic, which hugely concerns me. But you mentioned that it's not a concern to you because, it's not the government calling the shots here. But all the videos across YouTube are flagged with CDC warnings, right? Like they're getting their cues and working with the bureaucracy to govern what these rules are going to be. I mean, you've seen this same kind of sort of cooperation and meddling across the entertainment space with government and with like teachers unions and government. Teachers are not putting together policies for the classroom in a vacuum. They're talking to the CDC and vice versa and sharing ideas for what policy should be. I mean, social media companies do the same thing. They are working with the government on these policies.
They are, but it's the government, opened this door. I mean, the CDC, the vast new powers they have claimed for themselves. The CDC is running our housing policy, our immigration policy. It's a federal bureaucracy totally in love with itself and its newfound power that it never wants to give up. They're pushing these companies, right? They're telling these companies, yeah, censor all. We would like you to not be able to discuss the lab leak theory on this platform. We would like you to do more about misinformation. We're going to have a hearing next week. We're thinking about changing Section 230. We're thinking about breaking you up. We're going to do a FTC investigation. I mean, you're right. I wish these people were the people in charge of the social media companies were more courageous. They're not courageous at all. They're falling in line, but they're scared. They're threatened by the government and by the mainstream media. Yeah,
and they're threatened by both sides of the government. They're not. It's the left and the right now attacking them for different reasons.
Yeah, do you find that interesting, Mark? Like I think of how Senator Ted Cruz has said he's a fan of Rand and fan of Atlas Shrugged. I think he's read from it or cited it during previous kind of dramatic stands he made in Congress. And now, the way he's talking to Mark Zuckerberg, the way Wesley Mooch is talking to Hank Reardon and Dagny Taggart, and I'm like, do you remember what this book says? What is going on there?
Well, I think in the end, Ted Cruz is just a pragmatist and a bit of a power luster, to use an Ayn Rand phrase. And he's going to say and do whatever he needs to get on top, to dominate the situation. And if Rand is the quote du jour that fits the situation he's in, he'll use it. But if not, he's not a man who cares about contradictions or paradoxes. He fits in perfectly with the intellectual and political elite today.
So what's the playbook then for holding social media companies to account if we're kind of going from this rule book that regulation is and I think this is something that you had mentioned in your Rubin interview, that like regulation in and of itself is like this form of aggression against producers by the state. It's like this inherently violent act in a way. And I don't really know what to do with that when what we do see is collaboration and coercion between these two sectors all the time. It's not ideal that government drags social media companies around to do their bidding, but that is what they're doing, and that is already happening. And I feel like if we're going to give like the best opinion possible to social media companies under the guise that they act independently, that's not currently the case. They don't.
Well, that's true, but I mean, the problem is wide-reaching. I think Walter Williams was one of the first intellectuals to point out that the state of our Constitution today and the state of the long history of its violations is not just something that we can lay at the feet of Supreme Court justices. Mm-hmm. The people have wanted these changes as well. They think differently. There's a different ethic out there that's dominant in our world today. The real way we can change this is with an intellectual revolution. I mean, and that takes a long time. It took 120 years to get us to this point. It'll take several generations for individualism to come back in its best sense and become the dominant ideology again, if we continue fighting, if we continue offering the alternatives on medium like this. I mean, social media has, despite its flaws and despite its complicity with the government and despite the fact that it's sort of, in bed with the dominant ideas out there, it's amplified voices like ours immeasurably.
Yeah, and I think kind of going back to where we began, like we started by talking about a debate between Yaron Brook and this kind of socialist Twitch streamer Vaush, who have huge audiences both in their own right. And I've just learned so much from the past year being in the YouTube and streaming space, doing this show, about how much intellectual options there are out there online today. I mean, we really are, it feels like, in this Renaissance moment where there are just so many avenues you can go down to learn about ideas that are not being discussed via corporate media and whoever your given politician are who plays for Team Red or Team Blue. But we're still living in this republic of feelings. Everything in our society today is driven by your snap judgments, your emotions. And for me, that has to go back to social media companies as like what has sort of driven this forward. Do you sort of view like the social media revolution that really picked up around 2008 to 2010 as being sort of the beginning of that march towards just being a people who can only deal in emotional reaction to things?
No, but I think it's amplifying that. I think that was a quote unquote intellectual movement that's been metastasizing in America for decades and decades and decades. I think Rand probably wrote about it in the 60s. It's just that social media enables this primacy of emotion, a much more immediate access, and it allows these ideas to disseminate into the culture much faster. Crazy ideas like critical theory and critical race theory, and some of these activist academics have been germinating in universities for 40 years. but it's as if they just came into being.
Yeah.
Because social media has amplified their voices within, I'd say, a 6-year period. So decades and decades and decades, these ideas metastasizing in the university world have now just burst onto the social scene and are really changing things, because that's the power of an immediate delivery system like this kind of media.
And that does seem to be why we're rehashing, and I feel like this awful way, this battle between communists and fascists, alt-righters and tankies, that is all of a sudden like taken us back to the 1940s, because there was this end, right? Like the post-World War II period was the defeat in many ways of fascism, and then communism died off in 1990, and then it just incubated online, and it's spilling back out into the real world to kids who are acting like it's the first time they've ever thought of this idea called socialism and redistributing people's things and being nice to one another as a political ideology. It's made like the entirely dated world of those ideologies feel novel to people in a way that's not productive.
So social media has made it easier to connect with like-minded people who don't happen to live in your same village across great distances. So people who might have had very weird or very bad beliefs in a previous era might have gone to their graves thinking they were the only person who felt that way.
Yeah.
But now you can quickly find other people and you can form a little community, and that can have downsides. But I would point out that it also can have tremendous upside. You can cultivate ideological movements and discussions that are based around good ideas using that same technology. You can identify people whom you're interested in having conversations with and creating something with. So we really focus on, I mean, constantly over the last few weeks, oh my God, the downsides of social media. But I think some people forget, and many of these people who focus on the downsides are very just kind of hostile to capitalism and big companies making money in general. There are good things about these companies too, and the technology and what it's done for us in terms of even putting on the show, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the when you tell that story about people kind of realizing that like they're not alone in some way, that they're not the only person who ever had this thought. One of my favorite musicians used to go by the name of Tom Gable, sang in a band called Against Me, transitioned to living as a woman, Laura Jane Grace. It was like 5-6 years ago, something like that. And she would always talk about how kind of growing up and sort of living her life as a man, that she felt alone. Like there was nobody out there who also had these kind of feelings and this gender dysphoria and this feeling of being in the wrong skin. And if you were a young transgender person, that the only example that you had in your head was Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, that there was not a community. And then came the internet. And then you start meeting other people online who do have these same feelings. And then that internet connectivity not creates contagion effects, but it sort of gives people, they feel like the license to be like, all right, I'm not alone. This is a thing. This feeling that I had of this idea is a real thing, and I'm going to go do the thing now because other people are. And then you sort of end up in this moment where people are panicking, a social panic or a moral panic about the rise of transgenderism, the rise of like bisexuality is like the number one way in which young people today identify. And it's just because everybody sort of sees that like they're not the only ones.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it does, and Mark, I know, I think you've expressed concern about this. I see your tweets, your social media presence. You know, the ease with which you can destroy someone's life on social media now. They're talking, of course, of cancel culture, the piling on people for wrongthink, and that really is a social media problem. You know, when I was young, if I'd said something, you know, callous or insensitive, that would have been the end of it. But now it sticks around for everything on the internet, and you can really hurt people. Mark, what are your thoughts on obviously a lot of people talk about cancel culture, and I think it is a real problem. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm not against cancel culture if you're really canceling people who hold terrible ideas. So should we sort of intellectually boycott fascism? Sure. But the fact that those words are used to describe people who don't actually fit into those categories, and then we use those descriptions to categorically destroy their lives, that is wrong. So I think there's got to be a way to bring slander and libel into these forums where the people who are being slandered and libeled have some kind of power that they can prosecute people, these sort of anonymous folks out there that are smearing them. But I think, look, I'm a guy who believes in an open marketplace of ideas, but that, some things it's okay for us to privately exclude, and even as a group to decide, this sucks. We don't have to outlaw it, but, the idea sucks. So
yeah, I think
repudiate it in public.
Your attitude about it, I think, is something like I identify with in a lot of ways, where not like an aloofness about cancel culture, but sort of this idea that people don't owe any sort of particular behavior or attitude towards you. You don't owe anything towards them. And you check yourself, Mark, like you carry yourself with a great amount of dignity, a great amount of discipline. And even though you have views that are not mainstream in Hollywood, I don't think I've ever seen Mark Pellegrino do a thing that would actually really draw the ire of people who live in your part of the world. Like, have you had an experience where you were worried about your professional reputation, your ability to work, having the views that you have? Yes. Selfishness is good.
Yes.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Absolutely. I've been attacked in multiple waves on social media for holding the political views that I hold. The people who attack me now, the last wave was a young group of adolescents, people under 18. They're the worst
kids
of them all. They're kids. They don't really have much context, and they have little triggers, little emotional triggers that set them off, and then they just sort of gang pile on you. And the more you try to defend yourself, the worse off you are. And then these people archive your tweets and put them in a long stream, an archived stream of tweets that they then pass around with each other on other social media forums in an attempt to continue a narrative, a bad narrative about who you are. They've often tweeted me these archived tweets as a record of how awful I am. And I look through these tweets and think, there's nothing here that says what you're saying. This does not describe the being that you're claiming I am, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And that's scary because, we've seen corporate weakness in the face of some of these mob onslaughts. We've seen network weakness in the face of these mob onslaughts. Not that they even believe that they're true. They just don't want to deal with the hassle, the potential hassle of this violence, associated with their show, this type of violence. So, I'm hoping that companies get balls and actually look at archived tweets and contextualize things to give the person whose neck is on the chopping block a fighting chance.
Well, they're going to have to. And there was a piece of good news this week, just yesterday before we sat down to tape this. Netflix came out with a pretty strong defense of Dave Chappelle and his special, The Closer, that has once again predictably drawn the ire of trans activists who want to see, his career grinded to a halt, and they want to see the special pulled from Netflix, which, like, on a practical level, I kind of was always looking at this going, I'm quite sure that there's a contract agreement that they can't just pull it, or they'd probably just lose millions and millions of dollars if they did that. But they offered a robust defense. And I was optimistic because it feels like the mood in the room is somewhat changing. Like there is a little bit of the tide turning back. Because Robby, you and I have disagreed on this in the past, like with Gina Carano and the Mandalorian situation. Because what Mark was describing there was like, studios don't want trouble. And if you are trouble, in any meaningful sense, real or imagined, there are other people they can hire. Right. They don't need you to play this role. And like my perspective was like Gina Carano was making things very hard for herself unnecessarily because she was replaceable. And that's exactly where cancel mobs can go.
That was a case where they don't want trouble. But the interesting thing with the Chappelle situation is, just from a tactical standpoint, if I could talk to these activists who want to, get Chappelle canceled, whatever, like, what are you doing? Everything you're doing is making it so that more people are going to watch this. You want to get people to really tune into something. Tell them it's dangerous and controversial and scary and unsafe, and we don't want you to hear it. We wish people would censor it. Well, people are going to flock to it. It's just that's human nature. That's the putting ratings on video games, the kind of thing. This video game's too dangerous. Your parents wouldn't want you to play this. Well, everybody wants to play the game now.
Indeed. Now, do you think the network is defending him in part because he's irreplaceable, because there's no other Dave Chappelle, or are there other aspects to this argument that make it him a compelling defense. I mean, if I hate to say this, but if he were white, would there be the same kind of defense for him?
I don't know. I think, again, like what I had mentioned was I would imagine that the reason that they're not going to take it down is because they can't. Like they would probably be in big trouble contractually for pulling his special after the fact. I would think that that's the reason this is about money. What do you think of that?
They had to know what they were getting into with this, right?
Surely.
You don't give this man a special if you're not prepared for him to say offensive jokes. Oh, well, I don't know. Mark, you probably have greater insight into this than either of us do for how much thinking through there are of various, like, oh yeah, we'll have a show with a controversial person. Wait, he said something controversial. I'm shocked. Maybe they're legitimately shocked. Maybe people don't think through, or they fine tune it. It'll be just this amount of controversy. Any less, and it's not successful anymore, and we have to yank it. And I don't. What's your experience for how much do studios or people making those kinds of decisions in entertainment, are they like really thinking about a public reaction and what if it's negative, or are they just kind of like, oh, we didn't see that coming?
I think it's context dependent. I think they would certainly be thinking those things. If I were to express myself in a certain way with respect to the show that I'm doing, I'm sure my network would have a very difficult time with it. But when you hire Dave Chappelle for something, you sort of know what you're getting into. You should know what you're getting into. You should expect controversy. And that's why you're hiring him in the first place. So I don't think they went into this with their eyes closed, let's put it that way. But hey, cancel culture is really unpredictable, you know, and it's not like they have objective standards. They're perpetually pissed off. And, you know, anything you say could be grist for their mill.
Well, that's what I'm saying, man. We're a republic of feelings now, and I don't know the way back to it where we can actually be a more objectivist people, a little bit cool-headed and fact-driven. But that's the ideal. Mark, you mentioned American Rust, so I'd like to close out with asking you a little bit about your new series on Showtime called American Rust, sort of a murder intrigue story that takes place in a sleepy Pennsylvania town. What's the top line of the show, and what have you learned as an actor and kind of discovered about your craft, the show, doing this that you haven't on other projects?
Wow. Well, yeah, you said pretty much the top line of the show. That's exactly what it is, a murder mystery that takes place in a town in the Rust Belt, a town that's seen, you know, better days, where people try to leave. Basically, Buell is a place you try to leave. You don't try to stay there, and some people are stuck there for various reasons. You know, what I learned, I think, craft-wise, was that it's still possible to do your craft under extreme COVID constraints, because the COVID constraints made the production situation very sanitized, and I'm not used to that. You know, normally when you get together to do a production, it's like a family. The unit becomes like a family, and you're integrating with each other on a very personal level, and you get to know the cast on a very personal level. You guys go out, break bread together, you do social things together, you bond, and then that connection comes across in the shooting. Well, we didn't have any of those opportunities really to be together. We were quarantined from moment one, and then there were strict regulations as to keeping a testing sequence going. And we lived in different spaces and didn't really get a chance to see each other on a social level. But somehow I think our connection still was able to come across on the screen, miraculously enough. I think because many of us are just old enough to be able to do that. But it was a challenge. That was a challenge, and I hope we don't have to deal with it for too much longer.
You know, Mark, I have to ask you about this. I am a big mega Lost fan. My wife and I we played. There was Lost music played at our wedding. I used to blog for one of the fan sites when I was getting started. We're on a rewatch right now. I am a top Lost. That was my first foray into journalism. So I wanted to ask you. You know, I've often kind of said I think there is a very light, very subtle pro individualism message in Lost. You played Jacob, the kind of the island deity who's hinted at for many seasons, and then in some ways turns out to be a humble figure, a figure without. Lost is often about how sources of authority don't actually know what's going on. The people running the island are right. They think they're taking cues from Jacob, but it's actually someone else. Can you talk maybe just very briefly about those kinds of themes on the show and what that was like?
I wish I could, because I was given no real information, thematic information from the directors or the producers, and very little direction beyond, yes, that's it, Jesus the carpenter. That's the idea.
That's what they told you?
And that's what they told me when I was doing a scene, I think with young Kate. The director came up to me and said, that's it, Jesus the carpenter. So that had a very specific meaning to me, so I attempted to let that flavor everything that I did. My personal experience was, listening to the Man in Black and thinking, I agree with you. Yeah, get off the island, do what you need to do, explore, live. You're not bound by some responsibility to mentor people or take care of this. I was actually on the Man in Black side while I was hearing him, and thought that Jacob sort of represented that sort of altruistic point of view, where his life was forfeit. It was this bigger cause that was more important. It was this other thing. It was the containment of hell, or whatever Jacob's actual function was, that was more important than his own life or happiness.
Yeah, what Mark...
Fascinating.
Fascinating. That is great, because what Mark is describing sounds a lot like what cast members on major franchises like Marvel and Star Wars say a lot about their experiences as well, is when you watch the behind-the-scene docs, the actors are always like, they don't tell me anything, right, because we're in this high spoiler sensitivity climate around big suspense series like Lost, right? And you're
Lost
looking
almost
for a big
pioneered
answer.
That a little bit.
Right.
The amount of secrecy around, they would film alternate endings for seasons, so that even the cast was in the dark.
So actors have to act without that context that the reviewing class has when they're going over this stuff. But
well, here's let me just add to that, and just add more fuel to that fire. When I auditioned for it, it was a completely different scene, a completely different character. I didn't know I was Jacob until I landed on the island and met Michael Emerson on the set, when he said, "Oh, you're our Jacob." Ta-da.
Let's clean the slate. A little bit of good news. Robby, you've had a big week. What's going on good in your world?
I have a very simple kind of broad one. I now think, looking at the projections and what's going on, I think we are finally truly well and heading in the direction of being done with COVID, with it being such an important part of our lives. I think cases, certainly deaths, everything are going. I think this is the last. Could be wrong. Hate to make a projection, turn out to be wrong. I think this was the last peak. We're in the downslope now. That's a very good thing, something to be very thankful for.
Well, you mentioned COVID, so I'll go ahead and offer my smarmy good news. I was very delighted to see that the Fauci documentary, National Geographic on Disney Plus, has had a very bad time on Rotten Tomatoes. Its tomato meter was 92% with critics and 2% with audiences for the Fauci worship documentary. And I'm sorry, I just got a real kick out of it yesterday, and it's made me very happy. So there's some good news. People are done with the minister of the coronavirus. All good. Mark, what about you, man?
So I think Ayn Rand was right when she had great faith in the American people. They tend to know more what's going on than the elites. Mine's sort of COVID related too. I mean, over COVID, I think parents got to see what their children were really learning in school, and they are now pushing back against school boards everywhere. And not only that, withdrawing their kids from school and homeschooling and or putting them in private schools that don't ascribe to these idealistic, activist, intellectual ideas that are out there. So I think that will be great for our intellectual revolution that we need, to decouple kids from this statist ideology that they get from K through 12 and then into college. And I think this could be the beginning of a renaissance. It is a
good time for the Matrix to be coming back out, because there's a lot of red pilling going on in the world right now, from children's education to public health policies, to all of it. Y'all, this has been fun. To everybody listening, watching, more people are following us and subscribing every single day. That is good news for us. So we want to hear directly from you. What is your positive news? Please do send us a short video or text, and we'll get some of them onto the show. I might read them myself if it's text. You can email it to us, video or written, at rightly@aljazeera.net. That's rightly@aljazeera.net, or post it on your own social accounts and tag us at rightlyaj. That's it for this episode of Right Now. I'm Stephen Kent with this week's guests, Mark Pellegrino and Robby Soave. Mark's new show is on Showtime. It's called American Rust, so go watch it, and do scoop up Robby Soave's new book, Tech Panic, out now wherever fine books are freely sold. We'll see you next week. We've got Declan Leary of the American Conservative Magazine and Nate Hotchman of National Review here to make their case for kicking libertarians to the curb of society. It should be very interesting. I'm excited for you to see this episode. So until then, do keep asking why, stay out of line, and be a bug in the system. Have a great week.